Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a little bit of information about the life of Sir G.B. Hunter. Now I just want to say that this is actually a rewrite of a video that I did over a year ago that I was never really happy with, so I wanted to do it again. Sir George Burton Hunter is such an important person in Wallsend's past that I felt he deserved a better video. And I know that I did cover some information about him in the Wallsend Mares video, but this is a bit more in depth. I do hope that you will enjoy it and find it interesting. Of course, many of you will be familiar with the name of Hunter in connection with Swan Hunters and also the hospital on the Green, and it does also appear in a lot of other places in Wallsend, such as Hunter's Court. Like many of the well-known people of Wallsend, George, however, was not born here. He was actually born in Sunderland on the 19th of December 1845. He was the third son of Thomas Hunter, who was a ship owner, and Elizabeth, who was the daughter of William Rowntree, who was a master mariner. It does seem that shipping played a big part in George's life through his family from the day he was born. By 1851, George was living in Bishop Wearmouth with his family, which at the time included his sisters Mary and Elizabeth and his brothers Thomas and William. Now, it wasn't easy to find anything about George's early school years, as my research didn't really turn up much information other than the fact that he seems to have been privately educated, which of course does suggest that the family did have money to be able to afford to send him to private schools. Moving on now to his working life, for which I do have more details. George started his working life at the age of just 13. Now back then you were able to leave school much sooner than you do today, and I am sure that some people would like that idea today. However, it wasn't as good as it sounds, as it did mean you then had to get a job, often to help support your family, and jobs were not very often in shops or offices. You would be more likely to find yourself working in service, in the collieries or in the shipyards, and they were all hard and sometimes dangerous jobs that I wouldn't have wanted to be doing when I was 13. George at first worked for Thomas Meek before becoming an apprentice for William Pyle, who was actually his cousin, and ran the shipbuilding company of Pyle and Hay in Monk Wearmouth. George was an apprentice ship's carpenter. By 1868, George had moved to Scotland, where he went to work for the company of Robert Napier and Sons. And although it's not clear how long George worked in Scotland, he only seems to have been there a couple of years, as by 1871 he had moved back to Sunderland, and he was now the manager of an iron shipbuilding company. Now this does go to show that George, like many before him, really had worked his way up from the bottom of the ladder to almost the top. Now I say almost, as of course his later jobs would make him much more well known and respected than this one. George at the time had formed a partnership with Samuel Peter Austin Jr., and they were trading under the name of Austin and Hunter. And there is no doubt that this was a foot in the door to the shipbuilding industry, and it would have made his name a lot more well known in the area than when he was a simple apprentice to his cousin. In 1873, George married Annie Hudson. Annie was the daughter of Charles Hudson of Whitby, and she was the niece of a man who was described as the Railway King, George Hudson. Now this was a title that he had apparently gained due to the fact that he controlled a significant part of the railway network in the 1840s, and this had been possible due to George Hudson inheriting a large sum of money which he had invested in railway shares, and he was also a politician. And there's actually quite a bit of history about him, but although I thought that this part was interesting and I did want to include it, I didn't want to get sidetracked from the actual subject of Mr. Hunter. George Hunter and Annie were married at St Mary the Virgin in Whitby. George at the time was 27 years old and Annie was 28. Now it has to be said that this was quite old to be entering into your first marriage in the 1800s, as people were seen as using the old term on the shelf if they were not married by the time they reached 20. During their marriage, George and Annie had 4 daughters and 2 sons, and the only names of children that I was able to find were Alice, George, Thomas, Nora, and possibly Ada. Sadly, their other child, who was a girl, did not survive. The photo that you can see on screen at the moment is said to be of Annie Hunter, but sadly I cannot confirm that this truly is the case, but I personally do think that it is Annie Hunter. In 1879, the partnership of Austen and Hunter was dissolved, and George then became the manager of a new firm by the name of C.S. Swan and Hunter on Tyneside. By 1893, Swan and Hunter was the largest shipbuilder on Tyneside, and the name of Swan and Hunter, which is slightly different to how most of us in Wallsend refer to it today, was well known all over the world, and the name Swan Hunters, which is more how we say it, remained well known until the yards actually closed down. And even now, when anyone mentions Swan Hunters, people say that they made the best ships in the world. Their reputation was, for many, many years, second to none. Around the same time that George went into partnership with C.S. Swan, he moved his family to Wallsend, and they moved into a property known as Weston Villa. Weston Villa is on the boundary between Wallsend and Walkerville. At the time that the Hunters lived there, it was one big house, but I believe that it has since been altered into 2 separate properties. The building is still there today though, but it is often quite hard to see for all the ivy that grows on the outside of it. The Hunters also had servants living in the house with them, and this was quite normal in those days for families of high status like George Hunter. Though sometimes the servants that they had were only a housekeeper, a cook, and possibly a nurse for the children if the family had young children at the time. The Hunter family lived in Weston Villa for 10 years before moving to Jesmond, to a property known as the Willows. Now, this too is still there, but I actually don't have any plans to take a photo of this. I have been up and had a look, so I do know where it is, but it's fairly pointless to take it from the roadside, as you wouldn't see anything but a wall, and I'm absolutely not going to go into somebody's garden to take a photo of their house. The Willows would be the last home that George lived in. Apart from his shipyard career, George was involved in many things in Wallsend. I have often felt that he fitted the old saying of being someone who would happily turn up for the opening of an envelope. If there was a foundation stone to be laid or a building to officially open, it was, more often than not, George Hunter you would see doing the job. But to be fair, George put a massive amount of time, energy and money into the expansion of Wallsend as a town. He was responsible for the building of the Wallsend Cafe, which I have covered in another video, and he was also responsible for the building of the Memorial Hall, which I hope to cover in an upcoming video when I have more time, because there's a lot of research that needs to be done into that one. And he also helped with the building of St. Luke's Church, given the land for the church to be built on, and he also donated money to the building costs. Like many other people at the time, he also owned a lot of land in Wallsend, which over the years he did end up giving away. And when I say that he gave it away, I mean more that he donated it for the use of the people of Wallsend, such as the Burn Closes, which he once owned. He also bought Wallsend Hall in 1914, which he had no plans to live in, as he was happily living in Jesmond at the time, and he donated this to the people of Wallsend. And the land that we now know as the Hall grounds was given to the borough of Wallsend to add to the Burn Closes and also to extend Wallsend Park. And his donation of the hall and the land was of course one of the reasons why the hospital on the green was eventually named after him. And George had hoped that the hall may have been used as a library, a picture gallery, a museum, lecture hall, classrooms, or as a committee and reception rooms for the mayors of Wallsend. And it was mostly the last one on the list that the hall ended up being used for, with part of it, as we know, becoming the hospital. George was also a member of the Wallsend School Board and was also elected Mayor of Wallsend for 1902 to 1903. And in 1911 he was made a Freeman of the Borough of Wallsend, and in 1918 he became Sir G.B. Hunter. Annie Hunter also played a large part in Wallsend's history, as she helped to set up Wallsend Nursing Association in 1894. She was also present at many opening ceremonies, but to be fair, I haven't really done much research into Annie, and Annie died in early January of 1927 and is buried in St Andrew's Cemetery in Newcastle. George died at the Willows in Jesmond in January of 1937 at the grand old age of 91, and he is also buried in St Andrew's Cemetery alongside his wife and daughter. And the photo that you can see on screen at the moment is the headstone that I was finally able to find recently. Sadly, it has fallen down, but you can still easily read all of the names on the stone itself. George left around £152,000 to his two sons, George and Thomas, and his married daughters. Well, actually, one of them wasn't married at the time. I do apologise for that. In today's money, that would be around £13 million. George's funeral took place on January the 25th, 1937 at St Andrew's Cemetery, and prior to the burial, a service was held at Jesmond Parish Church. Canon Goddard officiated, assisted by the Reverend J. H. Johnson, who was at the time the vicar of St Luke's in Wallsend, and the coffin was carried into the church by 6 policemen from the Wallsend division who had been especially requested for this job by George's family. It was said that thousands of people lined the streets to pay their respects as the procession passed on both the way to the church and to the cemetery, and hundreds of flowers were later placed on the grave. The funeral was said to be one of the biggest ever seen on Tyneside, and the papers at the time did actually list all of the important people who were present, but I'm not actually going to read the names out, as that would take up around 15 minutes to do, as so many were mentioned. But it is safe to say that there was a very large amount of Wallsend people present at the funeral. George Burton Hunter was, as I have said before, a very important man in the history of Wallsend. He did so much for the town at a time when it was barely more than a village. And I still, as I have most definitely said before, feel that we really should have some kind of monument to George in Wallsend today to commemorate the man who went a long way to build the place we know and love today, the place that most of us call home. I do hope that you have found this short little video about the life of Sir J.B. Hunter interesting and that you have enjoyed it. I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.